Sheriff Brody, a man whose handshake could crush granite but whose fingers fumbled with smartphones, had a problem. It wasn't crime, per se, though the recent rash of petty thefts in the East County had been a headache. No, Brody's current nemesis was far more insidious: his internet speed. Or rather, the lack thereof. Now, Brody wasn't a man who demanded much from technology. He preferred a good old-fashioned paper map to GPS, and his idea of social media was chatting with the regulars at the diner. But even he had his limits. Streaming his favorite classic westerns had become an exercise in patience, a jerky, pixelated slideshow punctuated by the dreaded buffering wheel. Emails took an eternity to load, and video calls with his grandkids were often cut short by dropped connections. The source of his digital woes? His shared Wi-Fi network. In a moment of neighborly generosity, or perhaps a lapse in judgment, Brody had agreed to share his internet connection with Mrs. Karen Davies next door. Karen, bless her heart or not, was a whirlwind of complaints and demands, and lately, her constant streaming and online shopping seemed to be sucking the life out of Brody's bandwidth. He knew he had to do something. The sheriff could handle hardened criminals, but this Wi-Fi situation was pushing him to the edge. It was time for a digital intervention. The Wi-Fi sharing agreement had started innocently enough. Karen, fresh off a cross-country move, had been without internet for a week, lamenting her inability to binge-watch her favorite reality shows and keep up with her online bridge club. Brody, ever the helpful neighbor, had offered to share his connection temporarily, just until her service was installed. "It's no trouble at all, Karen," he'd said, picturing a few emails and maybe some light browsing. He couldn't have been more wrong. The temporary arrangement stretched into months. Karen's internet service was perpetually delayed, and her gratitude quickly morphed into expectation. She treated the Wi-Fi as a basic human right, and Brody's network as her personal playground. Her complaints became legendary: the internet was too slow, the signal was weak in her sunroom, the buffering icon was a personal affront. She even called Brody once to complain that her online yoga class was lagging. Brody tried to be patient. He understood that people relied on the internet these days. But Karen's constant demands and her obliviousness to the strain she was putting on his connection were starting to wear thin. He'd even overheard her on the phone, bragging to a friend about how she was getting free internet from the sheriff next door. That was the last straw. The favor had become a burden, and Brody knew he had to reclaim his digital sovereignty. Brody, a man of action, didn't simply stew in his digital discontent. He tackled the problem head-on, albeit with a slight air of bewildered determination. First, he called the internet service provider, a conversation that left him more confused than when he started. He was bounced between automated menus, endured hold music that sounded suspiciously like dial-up modem noises, and finally spoke to a representative who spoke a language that vaguely resembled English but was mostly technical jargon. They suggested rebooting his modem, a suggestion he'd already tried multiple times. Next, he ventured into the treacherous waters of online research. He typed "slow internet fix" into Google and was immediately bombarded with articles promising instant solutions and magical speed boosts. He waded through blog posts filled with acronyms he didn't understand and software downloads that looked suspiciously like viruses. He even tried a speed test website, which informed him, in technical terms he couldn't decipher, that his internet was, in fact, slow. Finally, after hours of fruitless effort, Brody stumbled upon a suggestion that seemed simple enough: change the Wi-Fi password. A fresh start, the article called it. A clean slate. A digital reset. It sounded promising. It was a task he felt he could actually accomplish, even with his limited tech skills. It was time to take back control of his connection, one password change at a time. Changing the password, however, proved to be a Herculean task. Brody approached his router with the same trepidation he reserved for disarming a bomb. The blinking lights and cryptic symbols seemed to mock his technological ineptitude. He squinted at the tiny instruction manual, a document written in a language that seemed vaguely related to English but contained far too many technical terms. His first attempt involved unplugging every cable in the back of the router simultaneously, a move that plunged his house into darkness and required a call to the power company. The second attempt involved holding down the reset button for an indeterminate amount of time, resulting in nothing but a sore thumb. He even tried yelling at the router, convinced that a show of force might somehow compel it to cooperate. Finally, after consulting a YouTube video featuring a teenager with more piercings than teeth, Brody managed to access the router settings. The password change screen loomed before him, a blank field filled with infinite possibilities. He considered something simple, like password, but quickly dismissed it as too obvious. After much deliberation, he settled on Sheriff Brody 123, a combination of authority and numerical certainty. He clicked save, held his breath, and waited. The internet blinked, and then, miraculously, it worked. He had conquered the password. Now, to face the consequences. The fallout arrived sooner than Brody expected. He was just settling in with a cup of coffee, ready to enjoy the bliss of a buffer-free Western, when a furious pounding erupted at his front door. He opened it to find Karen, her face a mask of incandescent rage, practically vibrating with indignation. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice echoing across the quiet morning. "The internet is down. I was in the middle of a very important online auction." Brody, ever the calm and collected lawman, took a sip of his coffee. "Morning, Karen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Yes, I made a few changes to the Wi-Fi." "Changes?" she sputtered. "You cut me off. How dare you? I have a right to that internet. You promised." Brody sighed inwardly. He'd known this wouldn't be pleasant, but Karen's immediate hostility was still a bit jarring. He'd hoped for a civil conversation, a calm explanation. Instead, he was facing a digital firestorm fueled by interrupted online shopping and a profound sense of entitlement. It was going to be a long morning. "Just give me the new password," Karen demanded, her voice rising another octave. "It's the least you can do after ruining my auction." Brody remained calm, his years of dealing with unruly citizens serving him well. "Karen, I understand your frustration, but I'm afraid I can't do that. The internet has been incredibly slow lately, and I need it for work and personal use. Changing the password was the only way to improve the speed." "That's ridiculous," she shrieked. "I need the internet more than you do. I have important things to do online. I have friends to connect with, deals to make, cat videos to watch." Brody raised an eyebrow. "Cat videos? That's not the point." Karen snapped. "The point is, you're being selfish. You're denying me my basic right to internet access." She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "And if you don't give me that password right now, I'm going to. She paused, searching for the most effective threat. "I'm going to report you." "Report me?" Brody asked, genuinely curious. "Report me to whom, Karen?" "The Internet Police." "Don't mock me, Sheriff," she yelled, finally remembering his position. "I'll report you to the county board. I'll tell them how you're abusing your power and denying innocent citizens their internet privileges. You'll be sorry, Brody, you'll be very sorry." Brody simply chuckled, a low rumble that did little to appease Karen's escalating fury. "Karen, with all due respect, I think you're overreacting a tad." "Overreacting?" she shrieked, pulling out her phone with a flourish. "I'll show you overreacting. I'm calling the police." Brody's eyebrows shot up. "The police? Karen, seriously? Over a Wi-Fi password?" "This is not just about a Wi-Fi password," she declared, her voice trembling with indignation as she dialed 911. "This is about justice. This is about standing up for what's right. This is about. She paused, struggling to articulate her grievances in a way that would resonate with law enforcement. "He's illegally shutting off my internet access," she finally sputtered into the phone. "And I think he might be hacking me." Brody stared at her, dumbfounded. Hacking? Him? The man who struggled to program his DVR? This was beyond absurd. He could hear the 911 operator's voice, calm and professional, on the other end of Karen's phone. He braced himself. This was about to get interesting. Brody leaned against the doorframe, a mixture of amusement and slight annoyance playing on his face. Hacking? The accusation was so ludicrous it was almost funny. He imagined himself hunched over a keyboard, a digital Robin Hood stealing bandwidth from the rich and giving it to himself, apparently. The image was so absurd he nearly burst out laughing. Of course, there was also the annoyance factor. He had a job to do, a county to protect, and here he was, embroiled in a petty squabble with a neighbor over a Wi-Fi password. It was a waste of his time, a waste of the county's resources, and a testament to the absurdity of modern life. Still, he wasn't worried. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He owned the internet connection, he had the right to change the password, and he certainly hadn't been hacking anyone. He was confident that once the police arrived and heard his side of the story, they would quickly dismiss Karen's claims as the hysterical ramblings of an entitled neighbor. He just hoped they wouldn't take too long. His Western was starting to get cold. He took another sip of his coffee and waited, the calm before the storm. It wasn't long before the flashing lights of a patrol car illuminated the quiet suburban street. Two deputies, young and fresh-faced, emerged from the vehicle, their expressions a mixture of professional seriousness and barely concealed bewilderment. They approached Brody's house with the cautious demeanor one might reserve for a potential hostage situation. 911 call came in about illegal internet access. Deputy Miller said, consulting his notepad, his voice laced with a hint of incredulity. And possible hacking? Deputy Johnson, his partner, glanced at the well-manicured lawns and the tranquil atmosphere of the neighborhood. Doesn't exactly scream cybercrime headquarters, does it? He muttered under his breath. Karen, emboldened by the arrival of law enforcement, puffed out her chest and pointed an accusing finger at Brody. That's him. He's the hacker. He stole my internet. Brody sighed and stepped forward, extending a hand towards the deputies. Gentlemen, he said, his voice calm and authoritative. There seems to be a slight misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this inside? The deputies exchanged confused glances, unsure of what they were walking into. This was definitely not the kind of call they'd expected when they signed up for patrol duty. A Wi-Fi dispute? Hacking allegations? It was a new one, even for them. The deputies hesitated, glancing at each other again before cautiously stepping into Brody's living room. Karen followed close behind, practically vibrating with righteous indignation. All right, sir, Deputy Miller began, his voice still carefully neutral. Could you tell us your side of the story? Brody nodded calmly. Of course, officer. But before we begin, perhaps I should introduce myself properly. He paused, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. I'm Sheriff Brody. Of this county. The effect was instantaneous. Deputy Miller's jaw dropped. Deputy Johnson's eyes widened in disbelief. They both snapped to attention, their carefully rehearsed professional demeanor dissolving into a mixture of shock and mortification. Karen, who had been about to launch into another tirade, suddenly fell silent, her mouth agape. She stared at Brody, her face slowly turning a shade of crimson that rivaled the flashing lights outside. The realization of her colossal blunder washed over her in a wave of icy embarrassment. She had just called the police on the sheriff. Over a Wi-Fi password. And accused him of hacking. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen, ever the resourceful one, quickly attempted to salvage the situation. A nervous giggle escaped her lips. Well, isn't this just Awkward, she stammered, her voice now several octaves lower than before. I think there's been a slight misunderstanding. A little miscommunication, perhaps. She tried to catch Deputy Miller's eye, offering him a weak, apologetic smile. I'm sure Sheriff Brody can explain everything. It was just a temporary lapse in judgment on my part. I was just a little stressed about losing my internet connection. You know how it is. Deputy Miller, however, was not buying it. He'd seen enough bizarre situations in his short career to recognize a desperate attempt at damage control when he saw one. He exchanged a knowing glance with Deputy Johnson, who was struggling to suppress a grin. They were both well aware of the absurdity of the situation. They'd been called to the sheriff's house because his neighbor thought he was hacking her Wi-Fi. It was the kind of story that would be retold at the station for weeks to come. Ma'am, Deputy Miller said, his voice polite but firm. We understand that emotions can run high. But calling 911 should be reserved for genuine emergencies. Brody stepped forward, diffusing the tension with a calm and authoritative presence. Gentlemen, as you can see, this has been a rather unusual situation. He directed a pointed look at Karen, who was now shrinking into the floral wallpaper. Mrs. Davies here was under the impression that she had a permanent arrangement to share my Wi-Fi network, Brody explained, his voice measured and professional. While I initially offered to share my connection as a temporary courtesy, the arrangement became unsustainable. My internet speed was significantly impacted, and I needed to make changes to address the issue. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Changing the password was a necessary step to ensure the efficient use of my own internet service. There was no malicious intent, no illegal activity, and certainly no hacking involved. He turned to Karen, his expression firm but not unkind. I hope, Mrs. Davies, that you now understand the situation and appreciate the importance of using emergency services responsibly. The deputies nodded in understanding, clearly relieved that the situation was being resolved without further drama. Deputy Miller cleared his throat. Well, Sheriff, it seems like everything is under control here. We'll be going then. He shot Karen a final, cautionary glance. Have a good day, ma'am. And please, think before you dial. With the deputies gone, an awkward silence hung in the air. Karen, still mortified, mumbled a barely audible apology. It was less a sincere expression of remorse and more a desperate attempt to escape further embarrassment. Sorry, Brody, she mumbled, avoiding eye contact. I just overreacted. Brody simply nodded, accepting the apology for what it was. He knew forcing a more genuine expression would be futile. The Wi-Fi agreement, or rather, the lack thereof, was now firmly established. There would be no more shared internet access. The digital bridge between their houses had been burned. Whether this marked the restoration of neighborhood peace or the beginning of a Cold War remained to be seen. Brody suspected the latter. Karen, despite her embarrassment, was not one to let go of a grudge easily. He anticipated subtle acts of retaliation, strategically placed lawn gnomes, passive-aggressive gardening, perhaps even a carefully orchestrated campaign of neighborhood gossip. But Brody was prepared. He had dealt with far worse criminals than a disgruntled neighbor with a penchant for online shopping. He had his westerns, his faster internet, and the satisfaction of knowing he had stood his ground. He was ready for whatever Karen might throw his way. The password had changed, and so had the dynamic of their neighborly relationship. Back at the sheriff's department, the story of the great Wi-Fi password caper quickly spread like wildfire. Brody became the subject of endless teasing, his colleagues peppering him with questions about his hacking skills, and his newfound appreciation for the complexities of router configurations. So, Sheriff, Deputy Johnson quipped, winking, you going to start requiring all new recruits to pass a Wi-Fi security certification? Even the chief got in on the act, presenting Brody with a novelty keyboard adorned with oversized, brightly colored keys. For all your future cybercrime fighting needs, Sheriff, he chuckled. The story soon transcended the walls of the department and became a local legend. It was whispered in the aisles of the grocery store, chuckled over at the diner, and debated at the town council meetings. Karen, of course, became an instant pariah, forever known as the woman who called 911 on the sheriff over Wi-Fi. Brody, despite his initial annoyance, found himself enjoying the notoriety. It was a reminder that even in the midst of serious law enforcement, there was always room for a little bit of absurdity. He also gained a newfound appreciation for strong passwords. He even considered hiring a tech consultant to fortify his home network, just in case Karen decided to escalate the digital Cold War. After all, a sheriff could never be too prepared. In the end, the tale of Karen and the sheriff's Wi-Fi became a cautionary one, a modern-day parable about the pitfalls of entitlement, the importance of clear communication, and the unexpected ways technology can both connect and divide us. It served as a reminder that even the simplest acts of neighborly kindness can be twisted into sources of conflict when expectations are left unchecked and a sense of entitlement takes root. It highlighted the crucial role of open and honest communication in resolving disputes before they escalate into absurd, police-involving situations. And, perhaps most importantly, it underscored the often overlooked truth that technology, while designed to simplify our lives, can also create new and unexpected avenues for conflict. From bandwidth hogging to password disputes, the digital age has presented us with a whole new set of challenges to navigate. So, the next time you're tempted to share your Wi-Fi password with a neighbor, remember the story of Sheriff Brody and Karen. Remember the flashing lights, the bewildered deputies, and the mumbled apology. And remember that a little bit of communication and a healthy dose of digital boundaries can go a long way in preserving neighborhood peace and preventing a 911 call that you, and your local sheriff, will never forget. And maybe, just maybe, invest in a really strong password. You never know when you might need it.